A woman did not need to fight to erase her rival. She only needed to be kind in the right way. In a court where every glance was measured, and every silence carried weight. Nothing loud was ever required. No accusations. No confrontations. No visible battles. Only gestures so controlled they began to shape how others saw the truth. What looked like grace slowly turned into pressure, and what felt like mercy became something harder to escape. One woman remained untouchable, while the other began to fade without ever being told to leave. Tonight, you will step into a world where kindness decides who stays, and who quietly disappears. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, to leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone lingered at the edge of a Tudor court gathering, they would begin to notice that nothing truly happened in private. Conversations might appear soft. Movements might seem ordinary. But every action unfolded under quiet attention. People did not need to stare directly to observe. They only needed to be present. The court was structured around visibility. The ceremony was not decorated. It was a function. The way a person entered a room. The order in which they greeted others. The distance they maintained while speaking. Each detail carried meaning. These were not habits formed out of politeness alone. They were signals. Signals that revealed position, intention, and control. No one explained these rules aloud. They were understood through repetition. A woman who lowered her gaze at the right moment appeared composed. A woman who held it a second too long could be remembered differently. A pause before responding might suggest restraint, or it might suggest calculation. The difference did not depend on what she meant. It depended on how others chose to see it. This is what made the court dangerous, not because of open conflict, but because interpretation replaced certainty. For women, this environment was more exacting. Their reputations were not built from a single action, but from a pattern of behavior that others observed over time. A misplaced gesture could remain longer than any spoken word. A small inconsistency could be repeated in quiet conversations until it became part of how she was understood. Reputation was never entirely personal. It was shaped collectively. A wife existed at the center of this system. Her presence was expected. Her behavior was read as stable. When she appeared in public, she was not simply herself. She represented continuity, order, and the expectation that nothing had broken. She did not need to assert authority. She only needed to remain unchanged. Her composure became a form of consistency that others relied on. Over time, that consistency carried weight, not because it was announced, but because it was repeated without variation. People trusted what did not shift. Private emotion had little place here. What she felt did not matter as much as what others could see. Anger, discomfort, or jealousy could exist, but they were not meant to be visible. To reveal them would be to disrupt the image that the court depended on to maintain its balance. So, emotion was contained, not removed, but kept beneath a surface that did not move. This created a quiet tension. Everything appeared controlled. Voices remained even. Gestures remained precise. No one seemed to lose composure. Yet beneath that stillness, judgments were forming constantly, without interruption. The court did not need confrontation to apply pressure. It applied pressure through attention. A glance could be noticed. A tone could be remembered. A hesitation could be repeated later in a different voice. None of this was formal. Yet all of it carried consequence. Nothing was ignored. Everything was absorbed. This is why appearance held more weight than intention. Because intention could not be seen. Only behavior could. And behavior, once observed, became something others could interpret, repeat, and quietly reshape into meaning. Within this system, politeness was not simply a social habit. It was structured. It allowed order to exist without visible force. It created a surface where everything appeared calm, while underneath, positions could shift without a single direct action. Because once people believed in what they saw, they no longer needed to question it. They accepted it, and in accepting it, they sustained it. This is how control settled into the smallest details, not through command, but through patterns that no one challenged. And within those patterns, a woman who never broke form could become something more than respected. She could become untouchable. Every movement was observed, and over time, observation quietly replaced judgment. What appeared to be simple politeness was already shaping how people would be seen and remembered. And once that silent system begins to favor one figure, another may find herself measured by standards she never agreed to. Her position did not begin in the room. It existed long before she entered it. The wife did not depend on presence to be recognized. She did not need to speak to confirm who she was. Her place had already been defined by structures that extended beyond the court itself. By law, by religion, and by agreements made between families long before any personal feeling had the chance to interfere. She was not simply acknowledged. She was established. This distinction was not always visible, but it shaped every interaction around her. When she appeared, she did not bring authority with her in an obvious way. There was no need for a display. The authority had already been assigned, quietly and firmly, by systems that others accepted without question. The law recognized her as the rightful partner. The church reinforced that recognition as something sacred. Together, they formed a boundary that could not easily be crossed. This boundary did not prevent others from entering the space around her, but it defined how far they could go. It marked a line that could be approached, but not replaced. And even when that line was ignored in private, it remained visible in public, where appearance mattered most. This is what gave her position its particular weight. It was not based on preference. It was based on permanence. The wife was not expected to compete for attention. She was expected to maintain continuity. Her role was to represent something stable in a setting where alliances shifted, and loyalties were often uncertain. She stood as a point of reference, a figure who signaled that certain things remained intact, regardless of what unfolded behind closed doors. This made her more than an individual. She became a symbol, not of affection, but of order. Her presence reassured others that the structure surrounding the household had not broken. Those agreements still held. That the lineage connected to her name remained intact and visible. These were not small matters in a court where inheritance, alliance, and reputation were closely tied together. A disruption to her position would not affect her alone. It would ripple outward. This is why her role was protected. Not always actively, not always with visible effort, but consistently enough that it became part of the court's expectation. She did not need to defend herself, because the system had already defined her as something that should remain, even in silence. That definition held. This is where her strength became difficult to challenge. Others might draw attention through presence, through charm, through the ability to influence a moment, but those forms of influence were temporary. They relied on continuation. They required renewal. They could weaken if attention shifted elsewhere. The wife did not rely on renewal. She relied on recognition that did not need to be repeated. This created a quiet imbalance. One position depended on being seen again and again. The other remained, even when not being watched. Over time, this difference shaped how others responded. People adjusted their behavior around what felt stable. They leaned toward what did not change. Not always consciously, but often enough that the pattern became clear. Stability did not need to be attracted. It only needed to endure. And endurance, in a setting like this, carried its own form of influence. The wife's composure reinforced this further. She did not display urgency. She did not react in ways that suggested her position was uncertain. Instead, she moved within the expectations already placed upon her, fulfilling them without visible strain. Each time she did this, she confirmed what others believed, that she belonged where she stood, and that belief reduced the need for explanation. Because once something is accepted as fixed, it becomes difficult to imagine it otherwise. This is what made her position resistant to replacement, not because it was stronger in emotion, but because it was stronger in structure. Emotion could draw someone closer, but the structure determined where they could remain. The wife existed within that structure completely. She was not passing through it. She was part of it. And this is what separated her from any other woman in the court. Others could be desired. She was embedded. Others could be favored. She was recognized. These differences did not always create immediate conflict, but they created distance. A distance that could not be closed simply by feeling. Because feeling, no matter how intense, did not carry the same authority as something already agreed upon by everyone present. The court did not need to say this directly. It was understood through behavior, through placement, through the subtle ways in which people oriented themselves around her presence without needing to be instructed. This is how her power operated, not through action, but through position. And a position, once fully accepted, did not need to defend itself. It only needed to remain exactly where it was. Her place was secured by systems that existed beyond personal desire, and that made it difficult to challenge. What she represented was not affection, but continuity that others had already agreed to preserve. And when one woman stands within something that cannot easily move, another may begin to realize that no matter how close she appears, she does not stand on the same ground. Her presence was visible, but never fixed. The mistress did not enter the court through the structure. She entered through attention. Her position was not granted by law, nor confirmed by ritual. It existed because she was noticed. After all, she was chosen, and because, for a time, she remained within that choice. But choice could change, and everyone understood that. She did not have a place that could be pointed to and named as hers. She occupied spaces that shifted depending on who was watching and how closely they were paying attention. Sometimes she stood near enough to be seen clearly. At other times, she remained just outside the center, present but not acknowledged in the same way. This uncertainty followed her everywhere. It shaped how she moved, how she spoke, and how she was understood by others. Unlike her wife, she could not rely on recognition that existed beyond the moment. Every appearance mattered. Every gesture had the potential to strengthen or weaken her standing. Nothing about her position could be assumed. It had to be maintained. This made her visible differently, not as a figure of stability, but as a figure of interest. People watched her not because they were required to, but because they were curious. Curiosity, however, did not carry the same protection as respect. It invited attention, but it also invited judgment, and judgment, once formed, could spread quietly. The mistress depended on the favor of one person. This dependency was rarely spoken of, but always understood. Her proximity, her influence, even her presence in certain rooms. All of it traced back to the attention she received from the man who chose her. Without that attention, her position would not hold. This made her power conditional. It existed, but only as long as it was sustained, and sustaining it required care. She had to remain desirable, but not excessive, visible, but not disruptive, engaging, but not unpredictable. These expectations were not written anywhere, yet they were felt in every interaction. A slight misstep could alter how she was seen. A shift in tone could change how others responded. There was no room for certainty, only adjustment. This constant adjustment created a kind of pressure that did not rest. Unlike the wife, who could rely on continuity, the mistress had to navigate a space where nothing remained fully secure. Even moments of favor carried a quiet awareness that they might not last. And because they might not last, they were watched more closely. Others observed her not simply to understand her, but to anticipate change. Servants noticed where she stood. Ladies noted how she was received. Men paid attention to how long she remained in a conversation. Each detail became part of a larger pattern that others assembled over time. She did not control this pattern. She existed within it. This meant that even her silence could be interpreted. Even her restraint could be questioned. If she appeared too confident, it could be seen as overreach. If she appeared too careful, it could be seen as insecurity. There was no stable position she could occupy without risk, because she did not have a position that was truly her own. She had access, and access was not the same as belonging. This difference was subtle, but it shaped everything. Belonging created expectation. Access created scrutiny. The more visible she became, the more others felt permitted to interpret her. And those interpretations did not remain private. They moved through the court in quiet exchanges, in softened voices, in passing remarks that did not seem significant on their own, but accumulated over time. This is how her image formed, not through declaration, but through repetition. And repetition, once established, was difficult to change. She might still stand near the center. She might still be noticed, but the meaning of that presence could shift without warning. A glance that once suggested favor could later suggest imbalance. A gesture that once seemed charming could later seem excessive. Nothing about her remained fixed enough to resist reinterpretation. This made her position fragile in a way that was not immediately visible. From a distance, she could appear powerful, but that power did not rest on anything stable. It rested on feeling, and feeling, no matter how strong, could move. This is what set her apart from the wife. The wife existed within a structure that supported her presence. The mistress existed within a tension that could withdraw. Over time, this difference became harder to ignore, not because it was announced, but because it revealed itself in the smallest shifts. In how people greeted her, how long do they hold her gaze, in how quickly conversations around her came to an end. None of this needed to be explained. It was understood. She was seen, but she was also measured and being measured, again and again, without a fixed place to stand, created a quiet instability that could not be easily corrected, because no matter how close she appeared, she did not belong to the structure that defined everything around her. Her presence depended on attention, and attention could never guarantee stability. What seemed like influence was built on something that required constant renewal. And when that foundation begins to shift, even slightly, the distance between visibility and belonging becomes impossible to ignore. Nothing about it appeared unusual at first. There were no raised voices, no sudden changes in tone, no visible signs that anything had shifted. Conversations continued as they always had. People moved through the same rooms, followed the same rituals, and spoke with the same measured care that defined the court. If anything, everything seemed calmer. The wife did not withdraw. She did not avoid the presence that others might have expected her to reject. Instead, she did something that felt almost inappropriate in its restraint. She acknowledged it, not with tension, not with visible discomfort, but with a form of politeness so precise that it left no space for open reaction. A greeting offered without hesitation, a tone that did not sharpen, a posture that remained unchanged. From a distance, it could be mistaken for generosity, and that was the point, because in a court where behavior was constantly interpreted, what appeared generous did not remain neutral. It began to shape perception. It began to define how others understood the situation. even when no one spoke about it directly. The absence of conflict became its own form of presence. People noticed what did not happen. They noticed that there were no scenes, no moments that disrupted the order of the room. They noticed that the wife remained composed in situations where emotion might have been expected. And over time, that composure began to take on meaning beyond itself. It suggested control, not forced, but chosen. This distinction mattered, because control that appeared forced could be questioned. Control that appeared natural became something others trusted. The wife did not look like she was restraining herself. She looked like someone who did not need to. And that difference began to settle into the way others saw her. At the same time, the mistress remained visible. She had not been removed. She had not been excluded. She continued to exist within the same spaces, under the same light, within the same patterns of attention. But the way that attention moved around her began to change. Not abruptly, gradually. Where once there might have been curiosity, there was now comparison. Where once there might have been interest, there was now quiet evaluation. And the more the wife remained steady, the more that comparison deepened. Because comparison does not require conflict. It only requires contrast. The wife did not create contrast through opposition. She created it through consistency. Each time she spoke without tension. Each time she acknowledged without hesitation. She reinforced an image that others could rely on. An image that did not fluctuate. An image that did not invite doubt. And in doing so, she created a surface that reflected everything around it, including the mistress. This is where the shift became difficult to avoid, because the mistress could no longer exist on her own terms. Her presence was now being understood in relation to something else, something more stable, something more controlled, something that did not react. Every movement she made carried that comparison with it, even if she remained composed. The comparison remained, even if she adjusted. The contrast did not disappear, because the standard had already been established. And once established, it did not need to be repeated to remain effective. This is how politeness changed form. It was no longer simply a social expectation. It became a reference point. And a reference point, once accepted, I began to define what appeared appropriate and what did not. The wife did not need to enforce this. Others did it for her. They responded differently. They adjusted their tone. They shifted their attention in ways that felt natural to them, but which followed the pattern that had already begun to take shape. No one announced this change. No one needed to, because it did not feel like a change. It felt like clarity. The absence of conflict made everything easier to accept. There was no moment to resist, no event to question. Nothing had happened that could be pointed to as the cause. And because there was no cause, there was no need to challenge the outcome. The situation simply settled, quietly, into something that appeared balanced. Even though the balance had already shifted, the mistress remained present. But presence was no longer enough, because presence without position could be redefined at any time. And now, her presence was being seen through a lens that she did not control. A lens shaped by something that appeared kind. But it was not without consequence, because kindness, when placed within a system that depends on perception, does not remain passive. It directs attention. It shapes interpretation. And over time, it determines where people stand without ever asking them to move. Nothing broke the surface. Yet the balance had already begun to move without sound. What appeared to be simple kindness was quietly turning into something others could not ignore. Once that quiet form settles in place, one woman stands untouched, while the other begins to lose ground without ever being pushed. The change became visible in the smallest details. The wife did not alter her position in any obvious way. She still appeared where she was expected. She still followed the same rituals, stood in the same places, and moved through the same spaces with measured precision. Nothing about her presence suggested that anything had shifted. But her tone had changed. It was softer, not weaker, not uncertain, but controlled in a way that drew attention without demanding it. Each word was delivered without strain. Each sentence shaped carefully so that it carried no edge that others could react against. There was no tension in her voice, and that absence became noticeable. In a court where emotion was often concealed but still expected to exist beneath the surface, her complete lack of visible strain created something unusual. It suggested that she was not managing her composure. She was simply not disturbed. This distinction settled quietly into the way others listened to her. Because composure that appears maintained invites curiosity. Composure that appears effortless invites trust. She extended this same tone outward. Not selectively, not cautiously, but openly. The mistress was not avoided. She was not ignored. Instead, she was acknowledged in full view of others. A greeting offered without hesitation. A brief exchange was carried out with the same calm that defined every other interaction. A question was asked in a tone that left no space for refusal without consequence. These moments were short, but they were never hidden. And because they were not hidden, they became part of what others observed and remembered. From a distance, it looked like courtesy, even generosity. The wife did not create distance. She reduced it, and in doing so, she removed the expectation of conflict. This was what made the gesture difficult to challenge, because it did not appear aggressive. It appeared correct. No one could object to politeness. No one could criticize a greeting delivered with restraint. No one could question a tone that carried no accusation. So nothing was questioned. Instead, everything was accepted, and acceptance allowed the pattern to repeat. The more the wife maintained this approach, the more it became expected. People began to anticipate it. They came to rely on the consistency of her behavior, not because they had been told to, but because it did not change. Repetition created familiarity. Familiarity created alignment. Others adjusted without realizing it. They mirrored her tone. They adopted her calm. They responded to her presence as if it defined the correct way to behave within that space. The court did not receive instructions. It followed the example. This is how she became something more than composed. She became a standard that did not need to be enforced, because it did not feel imposed. It felt natural. At the same time, the mistress remained within view. She had not been removed. She continued to exist within the same rooms, under the same observation, surrounded by the same attention. But the way that attention settled around her began to change. Not suddenly, gradually. Where once she might have been seen independently, she was now seen in relation to something else. Something steadier, something more controlled, something that did not react. And that comparison did not require explanation. It formed on its own. Every time the wife spoke without tension, the contrast deepened. Every time she acknowledged without hesitation, the difference became clearer. The mistress did not need to act for this to happen. Her presence alone was enough, because the standard had already been set. And once a standard exists, it does not need to be repeated to remain effective. Others carried it forward, in the way they responded, in the way they directed their attention, in the way they chose where to stand, who to approach, and how long to remain within a conversation. These were small adjustments, but they accumulated. Over time, they created a pattern that no one had formally agreed upon, yet everyone followed. This is how the wife transformed something simple into something structural. Her politeness did not remain a gesture. It became a reference point. And a reference point, once accepted, reshaped the space around it. She did not push. She did not confront. She did not need to. Because by maintaining a form of kindness that could not be questioned, she removed the possibility of opposing it. And in removing opposition, she removed the ground on which resistance could stand. The mistress remained present, but presence was no longer enough, because presence without control over perception could be altered without warning. And now, perception no longer belonged to her. It had already begun to settle elsewhere. Her kindness remained consistent, and consistency quietly shaped how others chose to respond. What appeared to be simple politeness was already defining what felt acceptable within the court. As that definition settles into place, one figure becomes the measure, while the other is gradually seen through it without being able to step outside. The shift did not feel like pressure at first. It felt like an allowance. The mistress was not pushed away. She was not excluded or denied access to the spaces she had already entered. Instead, she was received with a kind of composure that left no visible mark of resistance. The wife did not block her presence. She permitted it. And permission, when given without condition, can become something difficult to refuse. The mistress was no longer positioned as an intruder. She was positioned as someone being allowed to remain. This distinction was subtle, but it altered everything. Because once a person is seen as being allowed, they are no longer simply present. Their presence becomes something that depends on the restraint of another. It becomes something that can be taken away without needing to be announced. The wife did not say this directly. She did not need to. Her behavior suggested it. Each time she acknowledged the mistress without tension, each time she allowed her to remain within the same space without visible objection, she reinforced a quiet narrative that others began to understand. That nothing had been taken from her, that she had chosen not to react, and that choice began to carry meaning. The court did not interpret this as a weakness. It interpreted it as control, because restraint, when maintained consistently, does not appear passive. It appears deliberate, and deliberate restraint suggests that the person showing it does not need to defend their position. This is how the imbalance deepened. The mistress, without being directly addressed, was placed into a different role, not equal, not opposing, but secondary. She became the figure who existed because she was not refused, and that position created something difficult to escape. Gratitude, not spoken, not acknowledged openly, but implied through every interaction. Because if one person is seen as choosing not to react, then the other is seen as benefiting from that choice. Even if no one says it, even if no one intends it, the meaning forms on its own. The mistress could not reject this position without consequence. If she showed discomfort, it could be read as ingratitude. If she showed confidence, it could be read as overreach. If she remained silent, the interpretation remained unchanged. There was no response available that could remove the implication, because the implication was not created by her. It was created by perception, and perception, once shared, becomes difficult to alter. This is where kindness changed its function. It was no longer simply a gesture. It became a form of pressure, not applied directly, but sustained through repetition. Each polite exchange added to the same pattern. Each calm acknowledgement reinforced the same understanding. Over time, the repetition made the pattern feel natural, as though it had always been there. And what feels natural is rarely questioned. Others began to respond accordingly. They did not confront the mistress. They did not speak against her openly, but their tone shifted. Their attention adjusted. They began to align themselves with what appeared stable, what appeared controlled, what appeared above reaction. And that alignment carried weight, because it did not need to be declared. It revealed itself in small ways, in how conversations formed around the wife, in how the mistress was included, but not centered, in how her presence no longer drew the same kind of attention it once had. None of this happened suddenly. It accumulated, and accumulation, when left uninterrupted, becomes difficult to reverse. The mistress remained where she had been, but the meaning of that position had changed. She was no longer simply someone who held attention. She was someone who existed within a boundary she did not define, a boundary shaped by restraint, a boundary maintained by someone who did not need to enforce it. This is what made the situation difficult to confront, because there was nothing visible to oppose. No harsh words, no direct exclusion, no moment that could be pointed to as the cause. Only a series of gestures that, taken individually, appeared harmless, but together created something heavier, a sense that remaining required acceptance, a sense that acceptance required acknowledgement, and a sense that acknowledgement could never be equal. The mistress could continue to stand in the same space, but she could not stand there without feeling the difference, because the difference did not come from action. It came from interpretation, and interpretation, once shared across a court that watched everything, became something that followed her without needing to be repeated. Nothing was taken from her, yet her position had already begun to feel conditional. What appeared to be kindness was quietly placing her within a role she did not choose. That role settles into how others see her, making it possible to remain, yet never without the weight of something she cannot openly refuse. Attention did not need direction to settle where it felt most certain. No command was given. No instruction passed from one voice to another. Yet over time, observation began to gather more firmly around one figure. People did not decide this consciously. They did not pause to consider where their focus should rest. They simply responded to what appeared consistent, and consistency drew them without resistance. Nothing about this movement was sudden. It unfolded gradually, almost quietly enough to be missed. The wife did not change her behavior in any visible way. She remained as she had been, measured, composed, unchanged in tone and movement. Her gestures carried no urgency. Her voice revealed no strain, and her presence did not shift in response to the surrounding tension. This steadiness began to stand out, not because it was extraordinary, but because it did not fluctuate. In a setting where reactions were expected to be hidden, but still sensed beneath the surface, the absence of even that subtle variation created a different impression. It suggested that she was not adjusting to the situation. She existed apart from it. This perception settled slowly into the way others observed her. Each time she appeared unchanged, it confirmed something that did not need to be spoken. Each time she responded without visible reaction, it reinforced the same quiet conclusion. Over time, these repeated impressions became familiar enough that they no longer felt like observations. They felt like certainty. And certainty does not ask to be examined. It is accepted. People began to orient themselves toward what felt certain, not as a decision, but as a natural adjustment. They stood where it felt appropriate to stand. They directed their attention to where it felt stable to look. They aligned themselves with what did not create tension. This alignment was subtle, but it was consistent. Respect, in this environment, did not always take the form of admiration. It appeared as agreement, as a quiet willingness to follow what seemed reliable. The wife's composure became something others could move toward without needing to explain why, because moving toward stability required no justification. Moving toward uncertainty did. This is where perception extended beyond her. The mistress had not altered her behavior. She remained within the same spaces, visible under the same conditions, carrying the same presence that had once drawn attention so easily. Yet the way that attention settled around her began to shift, not through rejection, through comparison, placed beside something that did not change. Even small variations became noticeable. A slight adjustment in tone, a moment of hesitation, a glance that lingered just a fraction longer than expected. These details, once insignificant, began to carry weight within the contrast that had already been established. And contrast does not need emphasis. It exists on its own. Others did not need to discuss it openly. They did not need to name what they were seeing. The difference was absorbed through observation. repeated in memory, and quietly shared through tone and behavior. This is how interpretation formed, not through declaration, but through accumulation. The mistress did not control this process. She existed within it. Her presence, once independent, became relative. It was no longer understood on its own terms. It was understood in relation to something steadier, something more controlled, something that appeared unaffected by the same circumstances. And that relation altered everything, because being seen in contrast changes how one is received. Attention began to carry a different quality, less curiosity, more distance, less engagement, more evaluation. These changes were not immediate, but they did not reverse, because once attention adjusts, it rarely returns to its previous form without cause. Others began to respond accordingly. They did not declare loyalty. They did not form visible divisions. Instead, they leaned, gradually and almost unconsciously, toward what felt stable, toward what did not require explanation, toward what could be supported without risk. This leaning created something more durable than preference. It created protection. The wife did not ask for this protection. She did not seek it. Yet her composure positioned her in a place where others felt inclined to defend her without being told to do so. Her restraint was interpreted as strength. Her silence was understood as confidence. Her politeness was seen as something elevated, something that did not need to be questioned. She became difficult to challenge, not because she resisted, but because there was nothing visible to oppose. Perception, once shaped in this way, becomes self-sustaining. People reinforce what they already believe through the way they look, the way they listen, and the way they respond. Each interaction confirms the same pattern, and the pattern becomes stronger with each repetition. Within that pattern, the mistress did not need to be accused to be affected. She did not need to be excluded to feel distance. She simply needed to remain visible within a system that had already begun to interpret her differently. This is how the court exerted control, not through action, through attention, through the quiet decisions people made about where to look, how long to observe, and what to remember afterward. These decisions were small, almost invisible on their own. Yet together, they created a shared understanding that did not require agreement. It simply existed. And within that shared understanding, one figure remained aligned with stability, supported without question, and placed beyond easy doubt, while the other, still present and still visible, began to carry a meaning that shifted without warning, shaped not by what she intended, but by how she was seen. Attention settled without instruction, and that alone began to shape how each woman was understood. What appeared to be composure was quietly defining what felt stable and what did not. This shift remains in place without force, allowing one figure to stand protected, while the other is increasingly seen through a lens she cannot control. Nothing changed in a way that could be named. There were no proclamations, no visible divisions, no moments that marked a clear turning point. The court continued as it always had. Voices measured, gestures controlled, routines repeated with quiet precision. Yet something had begun to circulate. Not openly, but persistently. It moved through conversations that never fully formed, through glances that lingered just long enough to be noticed, through tones that shifted slightly without drawing attention to themselves. No one declared what they believed. No one needed to. They implied it. This is how the court spoke when certainty had already settled. The wife was no longer simply observed. She was interpreted. Her composure, repeated without variation, had begun to take on meaning beyond itself. It was no longer seen as a restraint alone. It was understood as something elevated, something that suggested not only control, but moral clarity. People did not question her behavior. They explained it, and in explaining it, they gave it weight. Her calm became virtue. Her silence became dignity. Her politeness became something that stood above ordinary conduct, something that others could point to, quietly, as an example of how things should be. No one needed to defend her. There was nothing to defend, because her image had already been shaped into something that did not invite criticism. To question her would be to question the very standard the court had begun to accept, and few were willing to do that. Not openly, not even privately, because once a standard is shared, it becomes difficult to stand outside of it without consequence. This is how protection formed, not through action, through agreement, a quiet, unspoken agreement that this figure did not require scrutiny, that she existed beyond it. And once that agreement was settled, it began to influence everything around it, including how others were seen. The mistress remained present. She had not been removed. She continued to appear in the same spaces, under the same observation, moving within the same patterns of court life. But the way she was understood had already begun to shift. Not through accusation, through association. She was no longer seen independently. She was seen in relation to something else, something more stable, something more controlled, something that now carried the weight of approval. And in that comparison, her presence began to change. Meaning, not immediately, but gradually, where once she might have been viewed with interest, she was now approached with caution. Where once her presence might have drawn attention, it now created a subtle tension that others preferred not to engage with directly. This tension did not need to be expressed. It was felt. And because it was felt, it influenced behavior. Conversations shortened. Attention shifted elsewhere. Engagement became more measured. None of this appeared deliberate. No one announced the distance. But distance formed, quietly, through repetition, through small decisions that, on their own, seemed insignificant. A conversation was not continued, a glance not returned, a presence acknowledged, but not pursued. These moments accumulated, and in their accumulation, they created something that no one had openly chosen. Yet everyone followed. Isolation, not enforced, not declared, but present. The mistress did not lose access to the court. She lost ease within it. She could still stand in the same rooms, but those rooms no longer responded to her in the same way. And because nothing had been said, there was nothing she could respond to. No accusation to deny. No confrontation to meet. No action to resist. Only a shift in how she was received. A shift shaped entirely by perception. And perception, once shared across a space where every gesture was observed, became something that moved without needing direction. This is what made it difficult to challenge, because it did not appear as a force. It appeared as understanding. The court believed it was simply recognizing what was already clear. That one figure represented control, and the other did not. This belief did not need to be repeated. It sustained itself, through whispers that were never fully spoken, through judgments that were never formally expressed, through a shared sense of what felt correct, and what did not. A quiet understanding had already taken hold, even without being named. What appeared to be simple behavior was now shaping how the entire court chose to respond. From that shared perception, one figure begins to stand beyond question, while the other is slowly set apart without ever being directly confronted. The difference did not need to be stated for it to be understood. It revealed itself in small moments, repeated often enough to become familiar, quiet enough to avoid attention, yet clear enough to shape how people began to think. No one announced that a comparison had begun. No one suggested that one figure should be measured against another. It happened anyway, because once two presences exist within the same space, and one begins to carry a sense of stability, the other cannot remain untouched by that contrast. The wife did not adjust her behavior to create this effect. She simply remained consistent. Her movements stayed measured. her voice steady, her expressions controlled. Each appearance reinforced the same image, one that did not fluctuate with circumstance. She did not react more strongly when observed, nor did she withdraw when attention shifted. She remained exactly as she had been. And that sameness began to matter, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was predictable. Predictability, in a place defined by shifting loyalties and unspoken tensions, became something others leaned toward without realizing it. It required no interpretation. It asked for no explanation. It simply existed, and once it existed long enough, it became a reference point. Others began to measure what they saw against it. Not deliberately, but instinctively, the mistress did not choose to enter this comparison, yet she was placed within it. Her presence, once understood on its own terms, was now viewed beside something that did not change. This altered the way even the smallest details were perceived. A pause in her speech carried weight. A shift in her posture drew attention. A glance that lingered slightly too long began to suggest something more than it once had. These were not new behaviors, but they were newly noticed, because contrast sharpens perception. What once passed without comment now stood out against a background that had become defined by restraint. And once something stands out, it invites interpretation, not always fair, but rarely avoided. Others did not need to agree on what they saw. They only needed to notice it. And noticing, repeated across many observers, created a shared impression that did not require discussion. It settled into the atmosphere of the court, shaping how each figure was approached, how each gesture was received. The wife's composure began to take on greater meaning. It was no longer just control. It was discipline. It was no longer just silence. It was dignity. Each quality, once neutral, became elevated through repetition, reinforced by the way others responded to it. Respect gathered around her, not because it was demanded, but because it felt appropriate, because she did not disrupt the order others relied on. The mistress, by contrast, began to carry a different interpretation, not openly negative, but less certain, less aligned. She was not accused of anything, but she was no longer easily placed within the same sense of stability. And this uncertainty created pressure, not external, internal, because when a person becomes aware of how they are being seen, even without confirmation, their behavior begins to shift. Slight adjustments appear, efforts to correct perception emerge, and those efforts, however controlled, are noticed. The more one tries to align with a standard that was not originally their own, the more visible the attempt becomes. And visibility, in this case, did not restore balance. It deepened the contrast. The wife did not need to respond. She did not need to assert her position. Her consistency had already done that for her. The comparison continued without her participation, sustained by observation alone, sustained by the quiet agreement that one figure represented something stable, while the other did not fully match that image. No one declared this conclusion. Yet, it guided behavior. People moved closer to what felt certain. They withdrew, gently, from what felt less so, and this movement, repeated across the court, created a pressure that did not need to be applied directly. It existed within the space itself. The mistress did not lose her place through confrontation. She began to feel it narrowing through comparison. Each moment, each glance, each subtle shift in attention reinforced the same unspoken message, not loud enough to resist, but steady enough to remain. This is how contrast becomes control, not through force, but through perception that no longer allows two figures to exist equally within the same frame. No accusation was made, yet a comparison had already taken hold within every glance. What appeared to be simple composure was quietly becoming the standard others began to measure against. From that silent measurement, one presence grows more secure, while the other is left adjusting to a position that never quite fits. Presence did not arrive alone anymore. It entered the room, accompanied by something quieter, something smaller, yet far more difficult to challenge. Soft footsteps followed at a measured distance. Small hands remained close, guided without urgency. Nothing about this arrangement appeared unusual, yet it changed the way attention settled across the space. No announcement marked this shift. No deliberate signal was given. Still, everyone noticed. A woman standing alone could be observed, evaluated, and interpreted. A woman standing beside her children was no longer seen in the same way. Her image extended beyond herself. It carried something that reached forward, something that implied continuation. That implication mattered, not because it was spoken, because it was visible. At formal gatherings, she appeared with the same composure she had always maintained. Her posture did not stiffen. Her expression did not shift. Her movements remained controlled and even. One hand might rest lightly on a child's shoulder. A glance downward acknowledged their presence without interrupting her stillness. Each gesture remained minimal, nothing excessive, nothing that called attention to itself. Yet together, they formed a pattern that others began to recognize without effort. Motherhood, within this setting, was not only a role, it was a position that suggested permanence. It implied continuity of name, of bloodline, of order. It connected the present moment to something that extended beyond it. And once that connection became visible, it altered perception. She was no longer simply a wife, maintaining composure within a delicate situation. She was something anchored, something that could not be easily displaced without disturbing a structure larger than any individual relationship. No words were needed to establish this. Observation was enough. Each appearance reinforced the same quiet message. Stability did not belong to a moment. It belonged to something ongoing, something that would remain after conversations ended, after attention shifted, after tensions dissolved. That sense of continuation settled into how others responded. Voices lowered slightly in her presence. Movements became more deliberate. Attention no longer lingered in the same way it once had, searching for reaction or imbalance. Instead, it adjusted to accommodate what felt steady, what felt fixed. No one declared respect. They demonstrated it, through restraint, through distance, through the subtle ways they chose where to focus and where to withdraw. Children did not command authority, yet they changed how authority was perceived. Their presence created a boundary that did not need to be defined. It suggested that what stood before them was not temporary, not fragile, not easily removed. It suggested something that would endure. And endurance, within the court, carried its own quiet power. Elsewhere, in the same space, another presence remained, unchanged in form, unchanged in position, yet increasingly altered in meaning. She did not stand beside continuity. She did not carry forward anything that extended beyond the moment in which she existed. Her presence was immediate, visible, but not anchored. It depended on attention. It relied on feeling, and feeling shifts. The contrast did not need to be emphasized. It revealed itself, placed beside something that suggested permanence. Even stillness began to take on greater weight. Composure no longer appeared as simple restraint. It became something that belonged within a larger order, and anything outside that order began to feel less certain. No accusation was formed against the mistress. No visible rejection took place. Yet the space around her responded differently. Attention did not rest as easily. Engagement did not extend as far. There was nothing to resist, only a subtle narrowing of presence. She could still stand in the same rooms, but those rooms no longer held her in the same way, because what had been made visible elsewhere did not allow equal footing to remain. No direct action caused this. No confrontation enforced it. It emerged through contrast, through repetition, through the quiet consistency of one image that carried more than itself. The wife did not raise her voice. She did not assert her role. She allowed it to be seen. In the stillness of her posture, in the presence of those beside her, in the absence of any need to defend what was already understood. This is how the shield formed. Not as protection against attack, but as something that made an attack unnecessary, because nothing within that image invited challenge. To question it would require stepping outside what the court had already begun to accept, and few were willing to do that, not openly, not even in thought. So the structure remained, held in place not by force, but by recognition, reinforced not by words, but by the way attention continued to settle, again and again, in the same direction. Nothing was declared, yet the balance had already shifted through what was allowed to be seen. What appeared to be a simple presence was quietly becoming something larger than a single role. Within that quiet expansion, one figure stands inside a structure that cannot be moved, while the other remains visible, but no longer held in the same way. Silence did not appear as absence. It appeared as control. There were moments when a response would have been expected, a shift in tone, a tightening of expression, a gesture that revealed what lay beneath the surface. The court had seen such moments before, in other women, in other situations where tension could no longer be contained. Yet here, nothing broke. Her composure remained intact, not because nothing had happened, but because she chose not to let it surface in any visible way. No public reaction followed the quiet knowledge that had already spread through the court. No accusation formed. No confrontation was initiated. She did not deny. She did not confirm. She simply did not respond. And that absence of reaction began to carry meaning. At gatherings, she continued to move with the same measured rhythm. Her voice did not sharpen. Her posture did not stiffen. When she addressed others, her tone remained even, untouched by what might have been expected to disrupt it. Those who observed her closely searched for signs. They found none. No hesitation when his name was spoken. No shift when his presence entered the room. No visible trace of resentment, anger, or wounded pride. Nothing that could be interpreted as weakness. This did not erase what was known. It changed how it was understood, because in a space where every emotion risked becoming public, the refusal to display emotion suggested something else entirely. Not indifference, not ignorance, but restraint. And restraint, held consistently, began to resemble strength. She did not need to defend herself. She did not need to challenge him. Her silence created a contrast that did not require explanation. The more she refused to react, the more visible his position became. Not through accusation, through absence. Where a response should have been, there was none. Where conflict might have been expected, there was calm. And in that calm, attention shifted. Not toward what she did, toward what he had done. He could not point to her anger. He could not respond to a confrontation that never occurred. He was left standing beside a silence that did not accuse, yet did not absolve. This created something difficult to resolve, because, without conflict, there was no clear defense. Without accusation, there was no argument to counter, only a quiet imbalance that others could observe without being told how to interpret it. The court did not need instruction. It understood, not through words, through contrast. She continued to fulfill every visible expectation placed upon her. She appeared when required. She spoke when addressed. She maintained the structure that defined her role, without deviation. And by doing so, she removed any ground upon which she could be criticized. There was nothing to correct, nothing to question, nothing that could be used to shift attention away from what remained unspoken. This is how guilt began to form. Not imposed, not declared, but felt. He remained within the same spaces, under the same observation, yet the presence beside him no longer reacted in a way that allowed tension to release. There was no argument to close the distance, no anger to meet with explanation, only consistency. And consistency, when placed beside uncertainty, began to weigh heavily. The more she remained unchanged, the more visible his change became. Not through dramatic action, through a subtle difference, a glance that did not settle, a posture that did not hold, moments that passed without the ease they once carried. Others noticed. They did not speak of it directly. They did not need to, because the contrast was clear. She did not ask for sympathy. She did not invite support. Yet both began to gather around her, not because she demanded it, because she did not disrupt the order others preferred to maintain. The mistress remained present within this same arrangement, but her position did not benefit from silence. She existed within a space where attention now carried weight, shaped by what remained unspoken elsewhere. The absence of conflict did not create neutrality. It created direction, and that direction did not favor instability. No action removed her. No word dismissed her. Yet the space she occupied began to feel less secure, not because she had done anything differently, but because the silence surrounding her had begun to define something she could not control. This is how loyalty was displayed. Not through declaration, through refusal. Refusal to react. Refusal to accuse. Refusal to break the image that had already begun to shape how everything else was seen. And in that refusal, something shifted. Quietly, irreversibly. No words were spoken. Yet a form of loyalty had already been established through silence alone. What appeared to be restraint was quietly shaping how guilt began to take form without being named. Within that stillness, one presence remains untouched, while the other begins to carry a weight that cannot be easily set aside. Nothing was said to define what was happening, yet everything had already begun to reflect it. Her kindness did not reach outward in a way that demanded attention. It did not seek acknowledgement, nor did it attempt to correct what had already shifted. It remained steady, unchanged, present in the same measured gestures, the same controlled tone, the same absence of visible disturbance. But now, it no longer existed on its own. It began to reflect, not by intention, by contrast. Every action she maintained, every quiet greeting, every composed response, every moment in which she chose not to react, formed a surface against which others could be seen more clearly. She did not turn toward them. She did not look for a reaction. Still, they appeared within that reflection. The mistress felt it first, not as a direct pressure, not as something that could be named or resisted. It arrived as a subtle dissonance, a sense that the space she occupied no longer aligned with what surrounded it. Conversations did not unfold in the same way. Attention did not settle as easily. Nothing had been withdrawn from her, yet something had shifted. She remained visible, but visibility had changed. Where once she might have been seen without hesitation, she now felt observed differently, not with open judgment, not with accusation, but with a quiet awareness that did not resolve into comfort. She could not identify the source, because there was none, only a presence beside her that did not move, did not react, did not adjust, yet seemed to define the space more clearly than anything else within it. This is what made it difficult, because there was nothing to confront, nothing to answer, only a reflection that continued to exist, whether she chose to engage with it or not. She began to notice herself within it. Small things, a pause that lingered too long, a tone that did not settle, a movement that felt slightly out of place once it had already been made. These details, once unnoticed, became visible, not because they had changed, because the surface beside her had, And that surface did not distort. It did not exaggerate. It simply remained clear. The more she became aware of this, the more difficult it became to move without consideration. Each gesture carried the possibility of being seen against something that did not fluctuate. And awareness, once it takes hold, does not release easily. It stays, quietly, shaping behavior. The husband felt it differently, not as dissonance, as weight. He did not stand outside the reflection. He stood within it. Her silence had already created a space in which his actions could not be obscured. Her composure did not accuse him. It did not demand explanation, yet it did not allow his position to remain undefined. Because besides something that did not change, the difference becomes visible. He could not respond to her calm. There was nothing to respond to. He could not defend himself against an accusation that had never been made. There was no argument to meet. Only a stillness that did not move to accommodate him. This stillness held him in place. Not physically, perceptually. Others saw him through it. They did not speak openly. They did not assign blame. But their attention carried a different quality now. More measured, more aware, less willing to overlook what had already become visible through contrast. This is how the reflection expanded. Not through action, through presence, through the quiet persistence of something that remained unchanged, allowing everything else to be seen more clearly. The mistress could not escape it. The husband could not avoid it. And the court, though silent, responded to it, because reflection does not require agreement, only observation, and once observed, it cannot be entirely ignored. She did not intend to become this surface. She did not declare herself as one, yet by remaining as she was, unchanged, composed, yet silent, she allowed something to form around her that shaped how others understood themselves. Without instruction, without force, without a single word spoken aloud. This is how kindness transformed, not into comfort, into clarity, and clarity, once present, does not remain neutral. It reveals. No accusation was spoken, yet every presence had already begun to be reflected more clearly. What appeared to be kindness was quietly turning into something that revealed more than it concealed. Under that reflection, one figure remains unchanged, while the others begin to see themselves in ways they cannot easily ignore. Inclusion did not arrive as warmth. It arrived as permission. There was no visible shift in tone, no sudden softening that suggested reconciliation in the way others might expect. Instead, something quieter took place, an invitation extended, not with urgency, not with insistence, but with a calm that made refusal difficult without drawing attention. She did not reach outward in a way that appeared emotional. She reached outward in a way that appeared proper. At gatherings where presence carried meaning, the mistress was not excluded. Her absence would have created a space too easy to interpret, too open to speculation. Instead, she was acknowledged, named when necessary, included within the structure of the event. Nothing about this inclusion suggested closeness. Nothing about it suggested acceptance beyond what was required. Yet it remained deliberate, because exclusion would have created conflict, and conflict would have disrupted the balance that had already begun to favor her. So she chose another path. She allowed the mistress to remain visible, but only within a frame she controlled. The invitation itself was carefully measured. It did not elevate. It did not diminish. It placed the mistress within the same environment, but not within the same position. She could attend. She could be seen, but she could not define the space. That distinction was subtle, yet it shaped everything. At formal events, the arrangement of presence carried weight. Where one stood, who one addressed, and how long attention lingered. These details formed a quiet structure that others followed without instruction. Within this structure, the wife remained central, not through assertion, through placement. The mistress, though present, occupied a position that did not disrupt this arrangement. She was acknowledged, but not sought, included, but not elevated, visible, yet without influence. And because she had been invited, she could not easily withdraw without consequence. Absence would be noticed. Presence, however, required adjustment. This is how the distance was maintained. Not through separation, through proximity that did not allow equality. The wife did not close the space between them. She defined its limits. Every gesture remained controlled. A greeting offered with the same calm tone used for others. A glance that acknowledged presence without lingering. A conversation that remained brief, measured, and complete. Nothing extended beyond what was appropriate. Nothing crossed into familiarity. And this consistency made the boundary clear, without needing to be stated. The mistress could not claim exclusion. She had been invited. She could not claim hostility. None had been shown. Yet she could not step beyond the position that had been quietly established for her. This created a tension that did not resolve, because it offered no point of resistance. There was nothing to push against, only a structure that held its shape regardless of how she moved within it. Others observed this with care. They did not need to discuss it. They understood. The wife had not rejected. She had not embraced. She had allowed, and in allowing, she had defined the terms. This altered how the court responded. No one needed to choose sides openly. The structure had already guided their behavior. Attention remained centered where it felt stable. Engagement followed what appeared controlled. The mistress, though present, did not draw the same response. Not because she had been diminished, because the space did not expand around her in the same way. Inclusion, when shaped carefully, does not dissolve boundaries. It reveals them, and once revealed, they become difficult to cross without consequence. The wife did not enforce distance. She made it visible, and visibility, repeated across time, becomes something others accept without question. The mistress remained within the same rooms, yet she no longer moved freely within them. Each step carried awareness. Each interaction remained contained, because the space itself no longer allowed anything beyond what had already been quietly defined. This is how reconciliation was offered, not as a union, as control, not as closeness, as a structure. And within that structure, everything remained in place, exactly as it had been arranged. No rejection was made. Yet distance had already been carefully maintained through quiet inclusion. What appeared to be an invitation was quietly defining where each presence could and could not extend. Through that arrangement, one figure holds the center without effort, while the other remains inside the space, but never fully part of it. Resistance requires a surface to press against. Here, none was offered. No harsh word appeared to justify a reply. No visible exclusion created a reason to protest. No gesture crossed the line into hostility. Everything remained measured, controlled, and contained within what could be recognized as proper behavior. And that absence began to matter, because conflict does not begin on its own. It needs a cause. It needs something to answer. The mistress searched for it, even if only within herself. A moment that could be named unfair, a tone that could be interpreted as slight, a gesture that could be expanded into an offense. Nothing held. Each interaction ended before it could become anything more. A greeting remained a greeting. A glance remained neutral. A conversation closed without tension, without space for escalation. There was no opening, only completion. And completion, repeated, removed the possibility of building something larger. This is what made the reaction difficult, because reaction, without cause, exposes itself. To speak without provocation is to reveal imbalance. To act without reason is to draw attention not to the situation, but to oneself. She understood this, even if she could not fully accept it. Any visible frustration would stand alone, unsupported by what others could recognize as justification. Any attempt to challenge the situation would lack the grounding needed to make it convincing. And in a place where perception shaped reality, conviction mattered. Without it, the expression became risky, so restraint began to form, not chosen freely, but required. She could not raise her voice. She could not withdraw dramatically. She could not claim harm in a way that others would accept without hesitation, because nothing had been done to her that could be pointed to directly. Only a structure had formed around her, and structures do not invite confrontation in the same way actions do. They are harder to name, harder to resist. The wife did not need to defend her position. She had already ensured that no attack could land without turning back toward the one who initiated it. This is how control is extended, not by limiting movement, by shaping consequence. Every possible reaction carried risk. Every visible shift in behavior could be interpreted through a lens that had already been established. Calm, measured, unchanged. Against that, anything sharper appeared excessive. Anything louder appeared unstable. Anything emotional appeared misplaced. The mistress felt this without being told. It settled into how she moved, how she spoke, how she chose when to remain silent. Each decision carried awareness of how it might be seen, not just in isolation, but in contrast. In contrast, once fixed, it does not adjust easily. She could not become more composed than the figure who had already defined composure. She could not become more restrained than the one who had already established restraint as the norm. Any attempt to match would appear as an effort. And effort, in this context, revealed itself. This left little space, not empty, but narrow, a space where movement remained possible, but always observed, always measured against something that did not change. The court did not intervene. It did not need to. Its role had shifted from active observer to quiet interpreter. Each gesture was received through a framework that had already been accepted. No one needed to question the wife's behavior. It had become the standard, and anything outside that standard did not need to be condemned. It simply needed to be seen. The absence of conflict did not create peace. It created containment. The mistress remained present, yet she could not expand her presence beyond what had already been allowed. There was no justification to push further, no reason that would hold. This is how rebellion dissolves. Not through suppression, through a lack of foundation, without a cause that others recognize. Resistance becomes isolated, and isolation, in a space defined by shared perception, weakens even the strongest impulse to act. She did not lose her voice. She lost the ability to use it without consequence. And once that understanding settles, silence follows, not imposed, chosen, because every alternative leads back to the same place. Exposure. No conflict appeared. Yet every path toward resistance had already been quietly closed. What seemed like kindness was removing every reason that could justify opposition. Against that absence, one figure remains untouched, while the other is left with no ground on which to stand without revealing herself. Support did not gather loudly. It settled, not in a single moment, not through any visible alignment, but through small, repeated choices that gradually moved in the same direction. No declaration marked it. No agreement was spoken. Yet the movement was clear enough to be felt. Women within the court began to adjust. Not abruptly, not in a way that could be named. They continued their routines, attended the same gatherings, spoke within the same measured tones. Yet their attention shifted, almost imperceptibly, toward one figure whose presence had already begun to define stability. The wife did not ask for this. She did not seek allies. She did not call attention to what had already formed around her. Still, They gathered, because alignment, in such a space, often follows what feels secure, what feels consistent, what does not require explanation. Other women observed her. They noted the steadiness of her voice, the restraint in her movements, the absence of visible disruption. They recognized something within that consistency, something that matched the expectations placed upon them as well. And recognition creates connection, not always openly, but reliably, through shared understanding. They did not need to speak to one another about it. They responded in how they chose to engage. How long did they remain in conversation? Where they directed their attention during moments that mattered. A greeting was extended slightly longer, a glance held with quiet approval, a place made available beside her, not by instruction, but by habit. These gestures were small, but repetition gave them weight, and weight, over time, becomes structure. The mistress remained within this structure, yet she did not receive the same response. Not through exclusion, through difference. Other women did not turn away from her directly. They did not deny her presence, did not refuse her words. They maintained the same surface of politeness that defined the court. But something beneath that surface had shifted. Their engagement did not deepen. Their attention did not linger. Their responses remained brief, measured, and contained, as though each interaction had already reached its limit before it began. This created a form of distance that could not be named, because nothing visible enforced it. Yet, it remained. The mistress began to feel it, not as rejection, due to absence of ease, absence of extension, absence of the subtle affirmations that allow a person to feel anchored within a space. She could still speak, she could still stand among them, but she could not settle, because settlement requires a response. And response, here, had already begun to follow a different direction. Moral expectation played its part, not as judgment delivered openly, but as a shared framework through which behavior was understood. Other women did not accuse her of wrongdoing. They did not need to. They measured her against something that had already been accepted as proper. And in that measurement, the difference became visible, not exaggerated, not forced, simply present. The wife's composure aligned with that framework. The mistress's presence did not fully fit within it. And where something does not fit, distance forms. Quietly, without announcement, this distance was reinforced through subtle repetition. Invitations that did not extend. Conversations that did not continue. Attention that shifted elsewhere at the moment might have deepened. No single action defined it. But together, they shaped a pattern that others followed without instruction, because it felt appropriate, because it aligned with what had already been established. The mistress could not challenge this. There was no source to confront, no individual to oppose, only a network that responded as one, without ever appearing to coordinate. This is how pressure formed, not from above, from around, encircling without closing, limiting without restricting, allowing presence, but not influence. The wife did not control this network. She did not need to. Her consistency had already aligned her with it. And once alignment exists, support follows naturally, not as a strategy, as recognition. The court, shaped by these quiet interactions, began to settle into a new balance, one that did not rely on direct action, but on the accumulation of small, shared responses that reinforced the same perception. The mistress remained, yet she was no longer held in the same way, not pushed out, but not drawn in. And in that space between, isolation took form, not visible, but unmistakable. No alliance was declared, yet support had already gathered through quiet recognition. What appeared to be simple politeness was quietly shaping a network that responded in the same direction. Against that quiet alignment, One figure is steadily upheld, while the other remains present, but no longer embraced by the space around her. Nothing closed, yet nothing opened. Space remained as it had always been, wide enough for movement, structured enough for presence, familiar in its rhythm and expectation. No doors were shut, no barriers were raised. The court did not change its form. Still, something within it had become unreachable. Her expression did not harden. It softened. A calm, measured smile appeared where silence had once been enough. It did not stretch too far. It did not linger longer than necessary. It remained perfectly placed, perfectly timed, and perfectly controlled. Nothing about it suggested resistance. Nothing about it invited closeness. It existed in between, and that was where its strength lay, because what stands between cannot easily be moved. Each time she was approached, the same response met her: a slight incline of the head, a gentle curve of the lips, a tone that carried no weight beyond what was required. It never faltered. It was never revealed. It never gave more than what could be safely received. Others responded to it without hesitation. They accepted it as they would accept any gesture that fit within expectations. It required no interpretation, no adjustment, no reconsideration. It felt complete, and completeness leaves little space for anything else to enter. The mistress encountered it often, not as rejection, as a limit. There was no coldness to confront, no sharpness to resist, only a surface that did not change regardless of what stood before it. She could not break through it, because it did not resist. She could not move around it, because it followed the same pattern wherever she turned. Each attempt to engage met the same response: polite, measured, finished. There was no continuation, no opening that extended beyond the moment. The conversation began and ended within the same breath. Presence was acknowledged, then contained. Nothing escalated. Nothing deepened. This is how a boundary forms without appearing as one. The smile did not exclude. It defined. It marked the edge of what was allowed, not through refusal, but through completion. Everything offered was accepted. Nothing offered created more. And without expansion, there is no way forward. The mistress felt the effect of this more with each encounter. Not immediately, but steadily. Each interaction ended before it could become anything else. Each approach returned her to the same place she had begun. There was no progress, no shift, no moment in which something new could take hold. Only repetition. And repetition, when it does not change, becomes a form of containment. She could not accuse. There was nothing to point to. She could not challenge. There was no force to oppose. She could not withdraw in protest. Nothing had been denied to her. Every path remained open in appearance, yet none led anywhere. This is what made it difficult to remain, because presence without movement becomes weight. Each moment carried forward the same pattern, the same limit, the same quiet refusal to extend beyond what had already been established. The court did not intervene. It did not need to. It recognized the boundary without being told. Others followed the same rhythm. Their responses aligned with hers. Their interactions mirrored the same completion, the same measured distance, the same absence of extension. No one coordinated this. Yet it held, because it matched what had already begun to define the space. The mistress remained within it, but she could not alter it. She could not shift the rhythm. She could not create a new path where none had been allowed to form. Every attempt returned to the same place. And over time, that return became predictable. And predictability removes possibility. There was no confrontation to end, no conflict to resolve. Only a structure that continued to exist, unchanged, unaffected, complete in itself. This is how retreat begins. Not through defeat, through exhaustion, because remaining requires movement. And movement, here, no longer led anywhere. So stillness began to feel like the only option. Not imposed, chosen, because every other path had already been quietly closed. Nothing was denied. Yet no path remained open beyond what had already been defined. What appeared to be a simple smile was quietly holding every interaction in place. Under that still surface, one figure remains untouched, while the other begins to understand that staying no longer leads anywhere at all. Change did not arrive with a decision. It arrived with discomfort. Nothing visible marked the moment it began. No declaration. No sudden shift that others could point to and name. The structure around him remained the same. The faces, the routines, the expectations, all continued without interruption. Yet something within that structure no longer felt as it once had. He remained where he had always been. But ease did not follow him there. The presence beside him, steady, unchanged, silent, had begun to alter how his own position was perceived. Not through accusation, not through confrontation, through contrast that did not move, did not soften, did not give way. And in that contrast, something unsettled him. Guilt did not appear as a single emotion. It formed gradually, in moments that lingered longer than they should, in pauses that extended just beyond comfort, in the awareness that his actions now existed beside something that did not require explanation, yet made explanation feel necessary. He could not respond to her silence. There was nothing to answer. He could not defend himself against a charge that had never been made. There was no accusation to reject, only a presence that remained intact, allowing everything else to be seen more clearly. This clarity did not leave him untouched. Where once attention might have been drawn outward, toward excitement, toward movement, toward the unstable pull of something new, it now returned to him in a different form, more measured, more aware, less willing to overlook. The mistress still stood within the same space. Her presence had not changed in any visible way, yet the way he responded to it had, not abruptly, but steadily. What once held a certain intensity now felt less certain. What once drew him forward now carried a weight that did not resolve into ease. Each moment spent within that presence now existed beside another, quieter image, one that did not compete, yet did not disappear, and comparison, once established, does not fade easily. He began to notice what had once been overlooked, not in her, in himself, a shift in how he stood, a hesitation before he spoke, a sense that his position was no longer defined solely by what he chose, but by how those choices appeared beside something that did not change. The court observed this without comment. It did not intervene. It did not need to, because perception had already begun to move. Attention no longer followed him with the same unexamined ease. It lingered differently. It held longer. It suggested awareness without speaking it. He felt it, even when nothing was said, even when everything appeared unchanged. This is how attraction begins to weaken, not through loss, through interference. The presence of something stable, something unshaken, begins to alter how instability is received. What once felt compelling now carries uncertainty. What once felt immediate now feels incomplete. The mistress did not lose her place through action. She lost it through a comparison that did not favor her. He did not reject her. He began to withdraw from what no longer aligned with what had become visible elsewhere. And that withdrawal did not require a decision. It required recognition that one presence offered something that extended beyond the moment, while the other remained bound within it. Stability does not demand. It persists. And persistence, over time, begins to outweigh intensity. He did not choose stability in a single moment. He began to lean toward it, quietly, repeatedly. Each small adjustment moved him slightly away from what had once held him. Each moment of hesitation reduced the distance between what he had been and what he was becoming. Others noticed. Not a thorough statement. Through pattern. The pattern did not need to be explained. It revealed itself. The mistress remained. Yet her presence no longer carried the same pull. Not because it had changed. Because he had. And that change did not need to be complete to be visible. It only needed to begin. Nothing was decided. Yet his position had already begun to shift through quiet discomfort. What once appeared compelling was slowly losing its hold beside something that did not move. Through that growing awareness, one presence becomes easier to leave, while the other remains, without ever having to ask. Endurance does not demand attention. It sustains it. Nothing about her approach required urgency. No sudden actions. No visible escalation. No effort to force change within a short span of time. Everything remained slow, measured, almost indistinguishable from routine. And yet, it continued. That continuity became its strength. While others relied on moments, on intensity, on reaction, on the shifting weight of attention, she relied on repetition. Not repetition that drew notice, but repetition that settled into expectation. She remained consistent. Across days, across gatherings, across subtle changes in atmosphere that might have unsettled someone else. Her tone did not sharpen. Her posture did not adjust. Her presence did not fluctuate in response to what surrounded her. Nothing interrupted it, and because nothing interrupted it, others began to rely on it. This is how time began to work in her favor. Not quickly, but steadily. Each moment that passed without disruption reinforced the same impression: that she did not break, that she did not react, that she did not deviate from what had already been established. This consistency did not create spectacle. It created trust. The court did not speak of it openly. It absorbed it. Through observation, through repetition, through the quiet understanding that what remains unchanged over time begins to define what is considered reliable. Reliability, in such a space, carries weight beyond immediate appeal. It suggests continuity. It suggests safety. It suggests something that will remain when attention shifts elsewhere. The mistress could not compete with time. Her presence depended on immediacy, on moments that held attention, on interactions that required response, on a dynamic that did not extend easily beyond itself. And time does not favor what depends on immediacy. It favors what persists. As days passed, the contrast deepened, not dramatically, not in a way that could be marked, but in a way that could be felt. The wife's position did not require defense. It strengthened through continuation. Each quiet appearance, each measured interaction, each moment in which she remained unchanged added to something larger than the moment itself. A pattern that others began to trust. And once trust forms, it protects, without needing to be asked. The court began to align with what felt stable, not through decision, through inclination. People moved toward what did not disrupt them, toward what did not require explanation, toward what felt certain. Her presence offered that. Without effort, without declaration, without any visible attempt to claim it. This is how a reputation is formed, not through a single act, through accumulation, each small, a controlled moment, added to a larger image that did not need to be defended because it did not invite challenge. Nothing within it appeared unstable. Nothing within it suggested weakness. And because of that, it became difficult to question. The mistress, by contrast, remained tied to the present. Her influence did not accumulate in the same way. It depended on the continuation of attention, on maintaining a certain intensity that could not easily be sustained without change. And change introduces risk. Each shift carried the possibility of losing what had been gained. Each moment required renewal. And renewal, over time, becomes fragile. The wife did not need to renew. She needed only to remain. And remaining, over time, created something that extended beyond her individual actions. It protected her name. Not through defense, through the absence of disruption. No scandal formed around her. No visible conflict attached itself to her presence. Nothing that could be repeated, exaggerated, or used to shift perception away from what had already been established. This absence mattered, because in a space where reputation could be altered quickly, what remained untouched gained value. Her family name, tied to her consistency, remained intact. Not because it was actively shielded, because nothing struck it. And nothing struck it because nothing she did invited impact. This is how kindness became a strategy. Not in the moment. Over time, through patience, through repetition, through the quiet understanding that what does not break does not need to be repaired, and what does not need repair continues. Nothing dramatic occurred. Yet her position had already begun to strengthen over time. What appeared to be simple consistency was quietly building something that did not require defense. Across that quiet endurance, one presence becomes increasingly difficult to challenge, while the other begins to fade without ever being directly removed. Fatigue did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. At first, nothing seemed different enough to name. The same rooms, the same faces, the same routines continued without interruption. She remained present within them, moving as she always had, speaking when required, maintaining the appearance of control. Yet something beneath that surface had begun to shift. Not in the court. Within her, every moment now carries awareness. Not the kind that sharpens action, but the kind that weighs on it. A constant sense of being seen. Not directly, not openly, but persistently. Glances that did not linger long enough to be challenged. Silences that did not break, yet felt filled with something unspoken. She could not locate the source, because there was no single source, only a space that had begun to respond differently to her presence. Nothing was said, yet nothing was neutral. Each movement required consideration. Where to stand, when to speak, how long to remain within a conversation before it settles into something that could no longer be sustained. These decisions, once effortless, now required attention, and attention, when constant, becomes exhausting. She could not relax within the space she occupied, because relaxation requires trust, and trust had quietly withdrawn. Not visibly, but completely. She was not excluded. She was not confronted. Yet she could not exist without awareness of how she might be seen. This awareness did not offer clarity. It offered pressure. A pressure without direction. A pressure without release. She could not respond to it. There was nothing to respond to. She could not resist it. There was no force to oppose. She could not escape it, because it existed wherever she stood. This is what made it difficult to endure. Not the presence of others. The absence of certainty. She did not know how she was being understood. Only that she was being understood differently. And difference, when undefined, creates strain. She began to withdraw. Not visibly. Not in a way that others could point to. But in small adjustments that reduced her exposure. Conversations shortened. Appearances became more measured. Time within shared spaces decreased. Even when she remained physically present, she began to occupy less. Not because she was told to, because it felt necessary. Each moment carried the possibility of misalignment, of being seen in a way she could not correct. And correction, without knowing what needs to be corrected, becomes impossible. So she reduced the moments, reduced the chances, reduced herself. The court did not intervene. It did not need to. Its role had already been fulfilled. Perception had settled, and once settled, it required no reinforcement. Others continued as they had been. Their behavior did not change dramatically. It did not need to, because what had been established continued to guide them without effort. She felt this, even when nothing happened, even when everything appeared still. This stillness did not offer rest. It held her in place, without direction, without resolution. Over time, this began to wear down what remained of her certainty, not through a single event, but through repetition that did not allow relief. Each day carried the same weight. Each interaction returned her to the same awareness. Nothing changed, and that sameness became unbearable. She could not reclaim her position. She could not redefine how she was seen. She could not disrupt the structure that had already formed around her. All that remained was presence. And presence, without ease, becomes strain. Eventually, a decision begins to take shape. Not clearly, not all at once, but as a quiet recognition that remaining no longer preserves anything. Not dignity, not position, not even the illusion of control. Leaving does not appear as a loss. It appears as relief, a way to step outside what cannot be changed, a way to regain something that cannot exist within the space she now occupies. She does not announce it. She does not explain it. She begins to withdraw, gradually, until absence replaces presence. And absence, in this case, restores what presence could not. A fragment of dignity, held quietly, away from observation. Nothing was taken from her. Yet exhaustion had already begun to settle through constant awareness. What appeared to be a simple presence was quietly turning into something she could no longer sustain. In that slow erosion, staying becomes heavier than leaving, until absence feels like the only form of control she has left. Nothing marked the moment it ended. No raised voices, no final exchange, no visible break that others could gather around and name. The court continued as it always had, measured, contained, moving within the same patterns that had already defined it. Yet something had disappeared. Not suddenly, not in a way that called attention to itself. One presence simply ceased to occupy the space it once had. At first, it was difficult to notice. Absence, when it begins, often hides within routine. A place left unfilled at a gathering could be explained. A conversation not continued could be overlooked. A figure not seen for a day or two could be accounted for without concern. But absence, when repeated, does not remain unnoticed. It settles, quietly, until it becomes undeniable. She did not announce her departure. She did not leave behind an explanation. No gesture suggested a conclusion. No act signaled finality. Instead, she withdrew in increments so small they did not appear as a withdrawal at all. Less time in shared rooms. Fewer appearances at moments that once required her presence. Shorter engagements. Longer silence. Each step, on its own, seemed insignificant. Together, they formed distance. And distance, over time, became absence. The court did not react. It adjusted, not outwardly, but in subtle ways. It redistributed attention. Conversations filled the spaces she once occupied. Movements reorganized themselves without disruption. The rhythm remained intact, unchanged by what had quietly receded from it. This is how disappearance occurs in a place that values order above all else. Nothing breaks. Everything continues. The absence did not create a scandal, because scandal requires friction, requires opposition, requires something that can be repeated, exaggerated, and examined. There was none. No accusation had been made. No confrontation had taken place. Nothing had been said that could be carried beyond the moment in which it occurred. Without words, there was nothing to repeat. Without conflict, there was nothing to interpret. Only a shift. And shifts, when quiet enough, are accepted without resistance. The husband remained. His position did not change visibly, yet the space around him had altered. Not dramatically, but enough. The presence that had once required a response no longer demanded it. The tension that had once existed, though never named, had dissolved without resolution. And in that dissolution, something else became more apparent. Stability, not new, but no longer contrasted. The wife remained as she had always been, unchanged, composed, present in the same measured way that had defined her from the beginning. She did not acknowledge what had passed. She did not mark the absence. She did not adjust her behavior to reflect what had already occurred. Because for her, nothing had needed to change. Her position had not depended on removal. It had depended on remaining, and she had remained. Others observed this without comment. They did not need to speak of what had ended. They saw what continued. And continuation, when uninterrupted, becomes its own form of conclusion. The absence of scandal did not diminish what had taken place. It concealed it. Not completely, but enough. Enough that it did not disrupt the order the court depended on. Enough that it did not leave behind anything that required resolution. Enough that it allowed everything to continue as though nothing had ever needed to change. This is how the ending held. Not through declaration. Through continuity. One figure no longer stood within the space. Another never left it. And that difference did not need to be explained. It only needed to be seen. Nothing was announced. Yet her absence had already begun to settle into the space she once occupied. What appeared to be a quiet withdrawal was leaving no trace that could be questioned or repeated. In that silence, one figure disappears without resistance, while the other remains, unchanged, as though nothing had ever needed to end. Stability did not return all at once. It settled, not as a sudden correction, not as a visible restoration, but as a gradual easing of something that had once remained just beneath the surface. The tension that had shaped attention, though never openly acknowledged, no longer guided the same quiet awareness. The court continued, and in continuing, it began to feel whole again. Nothing needed to be repaired, because nothing had ever appeared broken. This is how order reasserted itself, not through intervention, through the absence of disruption. With one presence gone, the space reorganized without resistance. Conversations flowed without the subtle hesitation that had once accompanied them. Attention moved without needing to adjust, without needing to navigate an imbalance that could not be named. Everything aligned, not perfectly, but sufficiently enough that the court no longer felt divided by something it could not speak about. The structure held, and once it held without strain, it began to strengthen. Reputation followed. Not immediately, but steadily. The family name, once quietly observed within a space of uncertainty, now stood without contradiction. No competing image remained beside it. No contrast continued to shape how it was understood. It existed alone. And what exists alone within such a space becomes easier to define. The wife's presence, once part of a comparison, now stood without opposition. Her composure was no longer measured against anything else. Her silence was no longer contrasted with another's presence. It remained, unchallenged. This allowed perception to settle fully around her, not as a reaction, as a conclusion. Others no longer needed to interpret her behavior through tension. They no longer needed to consider alternative narratives. What had once required awareness now required none. She became what the court accepted without question, not because she had claimed it, because nothing remained to complicate it. This is how her position transformed, not into power that demanded attention, into authority that did not need it. She did not speak differently. She did not act differently. Yet the way others responded to her shifted. subtly, permanently. They looked to her not for instruction, but for alignment. Her presence suggested what was appropriate, what was measured, what remained within the boundaries that the court had come to rely on. And because those boundaries had held, they were trusted. Trust, once established, becomes self-sustaining. It does not need reinforcement. It continues through recognition. The court did not elevate her through a declaration. It adjusted around her. And in that adjustment, her position became central, not visibly, but functionally. Others followed her rhythm without realizing it. They mirrored her restraint, her composure, her control, not out of obligation, but because it felt consistent with what the space had become. This is how influence extends, not through command, through an example that no longer invites deviation. The absence that had created this shift did not remain visible. It faded. Not completely, but enough. Enough that it no longer shaped daily movement. Enough that it no longer required attention. What remained was what endured. And what endured defined what followed. The family name carried this forward, untouched by scandal, unmarked by conflict. There was nothing attached to it that could be repeated, questioned, or used to disrupt its standing. It existed within a narrative that had resolved without ever being spoken aloud. And silence, in this case, preserved it. No record of confrontation, no trace of division, only continuity. The wife did not need to maintain this position actively. It had already been secured. Through consistency, through restraint, through the absence of anything that could weaken it. This is what made it last. Not force, not visibility, but the quiet acceptance of something that had proven it would not break. And in a place where everything could shift, what does not shift becomes the point around which everything else settles. Nothing was restored. Yet the court had already begun to feel complete again. What appeared to be simple continuity was quietly reinforcing a structure that no longer required defense. From that quiet order, one figure becomes the standard that remains, while everything else aligns without needing to be told. Power does not always arrive with force. It often settles without being noticed. Not declared, not enforced, but accepted. And once accepted, it becomes far more difficult to resist than anything imposed from the outside. Within the Tudor court, where laws existed and authority was clearly defined, there remained another form of influence that did not belong to written rules or spoken commands. It moved quietly, shaped by perception, reinforced by repetition, and sustained by the agreement of those who never realized they were participating in it. This was not a power that punished. It was power that made punishment unnecessary. No decree had to be issued. No accusation had to be spoken, because the outcome had already been decided long before anything reached that stage. The wife did not rely on the law. She did not need to. Legal authority could secure her position on paper. But what she cultivated went far beyond that. It lived in how others interpreted her presence, how they responded to her silence, how they adjusted themselves without being asked. This is where soft power begins. Not in action, in perception. People did not follow her because they were told to. They followed because it felt correct, because everything around them suggested that this was the natural alignment, the proper balance, the expected behavior within a space that valued order above all else. No threat was required, because deviation carried its own consequences. A misplaced word, an inappropriate gesture, a tone that did not match the quiet restraint of the room. Each of these small misalignments became visible immediately, not through punishment, but through reaction. A glance held a moment too long, a silence that lasted just slightly longer than comfort allowed, a shift in attention that made absence more noticeable than presence. This is how control was exercised, not by restricting behavior directly, by defining what felt acceptable, Once that definition settled into the collective awareness of the court, it no longer needed to be reinforced. It maintained itself through observation alone. Everyone became part of it, not intentionally, but inevitably. The mistress could not escape this structure, not because she was confined, because she was seen, constantly, measured not against rules, but against expectations that had already been shaped by the wife's consistency. Every movement she made entered a space that had already decided how such movement would be interpreted. And interpretation is where power becomes irreversible. She could speak carefully. It would still be heard differently. She could remain silent. It would still be noticed. She could attempt to match the composure she observed. But imitation always arrives a moment too late. And that delay, however small, becomes visible to those who are already attuned to the original. This is why resistance fails. Not because it is forbidden, because it cannot fully align. The court did not need to reject her. It simply did not absorb her. And what is not absorbed eventually falls away. Not violently. Gradually. The wife never demanded loyalty. She allowed it to form. Through repetition. Through presence. Through a consistency that others began to rely on without realizing it. Reliance becomes attachment. Attachment becomes belief. And belief becomes something that no law can enforce. But no individual can easily undo. This is the true danger of soft power. It cannot be confronted directly. There is nothing to oppose. No figure to challenge. No command to resist. Only a structure that exists because everyone, in their own quiet way, continues to support it. Even those who suffer within it. Even those who are pushed to its edges. The mistress did not lose her position in a moment. She lost it in fragments. A glance here, a silence there, a shift in attention she could not correct, until eventually, nothing remained for her to hold. And by that point, there was nothing left to fight, because nothing had ever been taken, only redefined. This is how the wife's power endured, not through dominance, through inevitability, and inevitably, once established, does not need to be protected. It simply continues. Nothing was enforced. Yet control had already settled into place without resistance. What appeared to be a shared understanding was quietly shaping what could and could not remain. From that quiet agreement, one presence becomes impossible to displace, while the other fades without ever being directly removed. Nothing ended with a visible break. No doors were slammed. No voices were raised. And yet, something had already concluded long before anyone could name it. Courtesy remained, unchanged in tone, unchanged in gesture, unchanged in appearance. It continued to move through the court as it always had. Polite, measured, composed. No one could point to a moment where it transformed into something else. Because it never did. It simply revealed what it had always been capable of. A smile could still be offered. A greeting could still be exchanged. A seat could still be given. Everything remained in place. And within that perfect stillness, one presence no longer held weight. No accusation was needed. No dismissal had to be spoken, because the space itself had already shifted. The mistress was not pushed away. She was no longer held. There is a difference. Being removed creates resistance. Being unheld creates silence. And silence does not invite return. She could still appear, still walk through the same halls, still stand within the same rooms. But something had changed in how those spaces received her. Or perhaps more accurately, in how they no longer did. Her attention passed over her without pause. Conversation adjusted without acknowledgement. Presence became background. And background, over time, becomes absence. No one marked the moment she disappeared, because disappearance, in this form, does not happen at once. It dissolves, gradually, quietly, completely, The wife did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. No victory had been declared. No opponent had been defeated. There was only continuity. Her composure remained. Her gestures are unchanged. Her position is steady, as if nothing had ever threatened it. And this is what made it final. Because what ends without recognition cannot be reversed through confrontation. There is nothing to confront, nothing to reclaim, nothing to return to. The court continued, as it always had. Dinners were held, ceremonies unfolded, voices filled the same spaces, carried along familiar patterns of movement and restraint. Everything appeared untouched, yet something had been rewritten beneath it all. Not through decree, through repetition, through perception, through acceptance. Courtesy, in its purest form, had done what force could not. It had been removed without exposing. It had displaced without humiliating. It had resolved without leaving a trace. And because no trace remained, no challenge could follow. This is why it endured, not as a tactic, as a condition that shaped behavior, defined belonging, and determined who remained visible within a space that never needed to explain itself. The wife did not hold power in the way it is often understood. She did not command. She did not threaten. She did not impose. She remained, and in remaining, she allowed everything else to rearrange itself around her. This is the quietest form of control, and the most complete, because it leaves nothing behind to resist, nothing behind to remember. Only a structure that continues, as if it had always been this way. Nothing was taken, yet one presence had already disappeared without a trace. What appeared to be a simple courtesy was quietly deciding who could remain and who could not. From that still surface, everything continues unchanged, except for the one who is no longer there. The room grows quieter now, not because the court has emptied, but because the story has reached the point where nothing more needs to be added. You can almost imagine the soft rustle of fabric, the faint echo of footsteps along stone floors, the low murmur of voices that never rise high enough to break the surface of calm. Everything remains composed. Everything remains in place. And yet, you already understand that something has shifted beneath it all. That is often how history leaves its mark, not through loud endings, through quiet rearrangements that no one announces. If you have followed this journey from the beginning, you may notice how little was ever said directly. No confrontations, no dramatic scenes, no visible turning point, just a sequence of small, careful movements, each one almost too subtle to matter on its own. And yet, together, they changed everything. This is the kind of story that does not ask for attention. It asks for stillness, for patience, for the willingness to sit with what is not spoken. You may find that the most unsettling part is not what happened, but how it happened. How easily a position can dissolve without conflict. How quietly a presence can fade without being pushed. How something as gentle as kindness can carry a weight no one expects until it is already too late. There is no villain here in the way stories often prefer. No clear moment to point to and say, this is where it all changed. Because it never changes all at once. It settles, just as the night settles around you now. Perhaps you can imagine the dim glow of candlelight, steady and unmoving. The air feels still, untouched by urgency. Somewhere in the distance, a door closes softly, not to shut something out, but simply because it has reached its natural end. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just an ending that does not announce itself. And maybe that is why it lingers, because it feels so close to something real, something familiar, something that could happen without being noticed. Even now, you do not need to hold on to every detail. You do not need to remember every moment. Let them pass gently, the way they were told. Let the images soften. Let the voices fade. Let the structure of it all settle into something quiet and distant. There is nothing left to resolve. Nothing left to question, only the calm understanding that everything has already found its place. And as you rest with that thought, you may begin to notice how easy it is to let go of the tension that came with it. The mind no longer needs to follow each movement, no longer needs to anticipate what comes after, because nothing is coming after. Everything has already unfolded. So allow yourself to drift with that stillness. Let the quiet remain. Let the story close without a sound. And as the last traces of it fade, I hope you find yourself a little more at ease, a little more settled, as if the world has softened just enough for rest to take hold. Thank you for staying with this story. Thank you for listening all the way through. And now, gently, without effort, good night.